In this chapter, we will discuss motivation and emotion. And since there's a lot of information in this chapter, I highly recommend that you stop when you need to, stop the video, and take notes as needed. So first of all, we'll begin by defining what motivation and emotion are. So motivation, that can be a biological, emotional, cognitive, or social force that activates and directs our behavior. Now, emotion, on the other hand, is a psychological state, and that involves subjective experience, physiological response, and behavioral or expressive response. Now, there's three basic characteristics associated with motivation, and those are activation, which is refers to basic initiation or production of our behavior. And then there's persistence, which refers to our continued effort or determination to achieve a particular goal. And finally, intensity. And that is referred to as the quality or vigor of our response that usually accompanies our motivated behavior. Now, we're going to take a look at some different concepts and theories associated with motivation that we're look into different ideas of what motivation is and what how it manifests. So first of all, we'll take a look at instinct theory, and that was the theory that people are motivated to engage in our behavior, certain behaviors, because of evolutionary programming. So that also refers to, if you look at the bottom here, that refers to the idea that the general idea that human behaviors are innate and genetically influenced. So here's an example of some human instincts that William James came up with. So feel free to take a look at these, see what you think of these, and see if you can think of any others that you might add to the list of human instinct. Now, another theory that looked into motivation was called drive theory. And there are a few different ones here. And so first of all, what is drive? And so drive over here in the far left, that is defined as the need or internal motivational state. Now, drive theory, what that proposed is our behavior is motivated by our desire to reduce the internal tension caused by our unmet biological needs and our desire to restore homeostasis. So homeostasis just refers to a balanced state or a state that we normally, our normal state. Let's just leave it at that. Keep it simple. Now, drive state, that refers to the state that's created by unmet biological needs, and our drives are triggered by internal mechanisms of the homeostasis. And right here on the far right, that actually discusses homeostasis. And I already defined it in simple terms, so I'm moving on. Now, incentive motivation. Now, that's another reason why one may be motivated, another motivation why we may be motivated, to put it in a slightly joking manner. But basically, that refers to we have goals and objective goals that motivate us. So if we look here, that uses the term incentive theory, and that means our behavior is motivated by the pull of external goals such as rewards, money, recognition. And so we will move on from here. Arousal theory, that refers to optimal stimulation as a motivator. And so they say here that people experience both very high levels of arousal and very low levels of arousal as being quite unpleasant. Now, these are generalizations here. There are certain people, that require higher or lower levels of arousal than what we may call average. But I did make a note, and I will make notes throughout this video in red here. Now, I just said that people are generally motivated to maintain an optimal level of arousal. So keep that in mind. These are generalizations. Now, here's an exception to the generalization. People who seek optimal level of arousal, that is especially in like people that are known as sensation seekers, who really need heightened level of arousals or novel experiences, and in order to, that makes them happy. That makes them feel like doing it more. Now, another theory here is what's called the humanistic theory. And if you remember from previous discussions, humanism refers to the basic idea that humans are motivated in order to for self-fulfillment and optimization of their potential, things like that. So, researchers like Rogers and Maslow, they were responsible for these theories here. And on the right here, they just found that they're just, here's just an interesting photo here of young monkeys trying to open a lock that was complicated, even though despite, that they have a lack of an incentive or reward for their behavior. So they're just doing it just to experience, a sense of, fulfilling basically arousal needs. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some other types of motivation, and we're going to look into hunger and eating. And so, first of all, what's important is hunger is a biological motive, and I highly recommend you stop the video and just take a look at all these below here, just some factors involved with hunger and eating. Okay, and definitely, as I put in red right here, culture influences what we eat, when we eat, and how we eat. And so, some of you may find this interesting or disgusting, but they ask, would you order grasshoppers or caterpillars for lunch? Well, in some cultures they would. So this was just an example. And here's how basically through striving for a biological sense of homeostasis, how our body aims to achieve that homeostasis by balancing calories consumed with calories expended. So basically, calories in and energy out. And I highly recommend you stop and review these to gain further insight. Okay, so some psychological factors that trigger our eating. So this was divided into two categories: classical conditioning, and this goes into what time of day we eat, our blood levels of insulin, glucose, etc., increased body temperature, decreased metabolism, things like that. These are classically conditioned motivations. Now, on the other hand, there's operant conditioning, and that's the preference for certain tastes like sweet, salty, fatty, and that is just acting in accordance with a certain desire that you need to be met. Now, we discussed briefly satiation signals, and that's when to stop eating. And so this is the biological factors right here, signals from our stomach, stomach receptors in the stomach, things like that. I highly recommend you take a look at these on your own time. Now, long-term satiation signals when to stop eating, those can be also things, like hormones, things of that effect. Moving on. And then this just shows you here, and I mainly kept this in here so you can look at this diagram, how the hypothalamus, receives all the, sends and receives various signals from different organs and regions of the body. So all those are involved in understanding the motivation of eating and hunger. So these are, biological motivations. Now we talk about excess weight and obesity, and so there's what's called set point theory, and all that refers to is the body has an optimal body weight that it defends from becoming higher or lower by regulating our feelings of hunger and body metabolism. And here's this just talks about some of the factors involved in becoming overweight. I'm going to move on. And more factors involved in obesity. This talks about the interaction of genetics and environment. So it may not be intrinsically motivated, it may be extrinsically motivated. So this just talks about the various factors. I highly recommend you pause the video and take a look at each of these in depth. Now, another thing when it comes to obesity, there may be actually different effects or instances in the brain actually in itself, neurologically speaking. And take, for instance, one that dopamine receptors actually in obese individuals, dopamine receptors can be significantly fewer in number than normal weight individuals. So they eat more to compensate for reduced brain rewards. So overeating reduces the dopamine reward system levels even further, and then there's a vicious cycle. And that is one theory and one observation of why people become obese. And this just talks about, can overeating lead to brain changes in humans? And these were actually functional magnetic resonance imaging research, or FMRI. And so on the left here, basically all that just says is, that this just shows reduced dopaminergic or dopamine receptor activation in the brain, whereas in a quote unquote normal brain, you can see the increased activity right here. Okay, now we'll talk about the motivation of human sexuality. I am going to go through this quickly because there's a lot of information here and I don't want us to run out of time. So basically, multiple factors are involved in understanding human sexuality. So psychologists consider the drive to have sex. That's a basic human motive. Here's stages of human sexual response. Feel free to stop the video here and look at these a little more in depth on your own time. Okay, what motivates sexual behavior? So here are a few motivations. Survival of the species, hormonal changes in the female, and learning and environmental influences. All those actually motivate sexual behavior. Okay, now sexual orientation. Briefly, that I put this in red. I actually added a definition here for you. Basically, all that refers to is whether a person is attracted to members of the opposite sex, the same sex, or both sexes. And down below, you can look at some various examples of that. And here's an interesting thing for a lot of people learning first about the psychology of sexual orientation and what causes it, what determines it. And so actually, researchers have determined that things like genetics, prenatal environment, and brain structure, all of those determine sexual orientation. Please stop the video and look at this a little more in depth. Other findings about determination of sexual orientation that you may find interesting. And okay, so we're going to be getting to look at the psychological needs as motivators instead of the biological needs. So according to motivation theories, like Maslow and Deci and Ryan, psychological needs must be fulfilled for optimal human functioning. So some questions here, are there universal psychological needs? Are we internally or externally motivated to satisfy those sexual needs? and what psychological needs must be satisfied for optimal human functioning. So we'll take a look at those. So Maslow, he developed the now famous hierarchy of needs, and basically all this refers to is the basic needs down below must be met before one can actually start fulfilling safety needs, and then those must be met before fulfilling belongingness and love, etc., until one actually arrives at the state known as self-fulfillment. Now, one thing that's important to realize is now researchers and psychologists, recognize the fact that one can actually move throughout these various quote-unquote stages. It's definitely a malleable process, constantly changing. One never has to proceed through these stages in a hierarchical type order. That one can actually, be achieving some esteem needs while meeting physiological needs, and even some self-actualization or self-fulfillment needs, leading to self-actualization. All that can be happening simultaneously, and they can change throughout actually daily life. Okay, and then right here, Maslow, his characteristics of self-actualized people. I actually put some definitions in here, and I put those in red for you. I put the actual characteristics, and I highly recommend you stop the video and take a look at these. And then other researchers, Deci and Ryan, these are actually current researchers. They've actually determined that people are actively growth oriented, and that they move toward a unified sense of self and integration with others, and that's known as SelfDetermination Theory. And there's three. They said that there are three innate and universal psychological needs that must be satisfied, and those are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Okay, I'm moving on from this. We've discussed Maslow. And here's the competence and achievement motivations. So competence motivation, all that means is one is motivated when one strives to use their skills to be capable and exercise control. And now achievement motivation, that's the drive to excel, succeed, or outperform others at some task, which is, can be a common type motivation in sports or business, etc., etc. Moving on. Now, what about motivation and culture? So individualistic cultures tend to focus on personal and individual success rather than the group success, whereas collectivistic cultures, they are more oriented to achieve social harmony and promoting one's growth, group and or family. Okay, so now we're going to move on to a discussion of motivation. What are they, and what are the various manifestations one experiences? So a good definition of emotion, that is complex psychological state that involves subjective experience, a physiological response, and or a behavioral or expressive response. And we will take a look at those more in depth as we go. Now, one thing to understand is in emotion, that is defined a little differently than what a mood would be. So a mood is a milder emotional state, and it's more general and pervasive, such as, feeling gloomy or content. So, it's, whereas an emotion is a lot more complex and might be a little more intense in nature. Now, what are the functions of emotion? So, early psychologists, they considered emotions to be kind of disruptive forces that interfered with rational behavior. So early on, psychologists looked at emotions as being like things to avoid because they actually avoided thinking rationally and logically. But now, we know that psychologists know today that that's actually too simplistic, and it actually does not respect all the emotional side and how that those are important to our overall sense of achievement, wellness, self-fulfillment, etc., etc. And here's a list of today's views about emotions. I highly recommend you take a look at those. Here's an example of what Darwin thought emotions were in the beginning. He said that emotions reflect evolutionary adaptation to problems of survival and reproduction. And whereas today, psychologists feel and think that emotions, they aid us. They actually aid us in solving adaptive problems posed by the environment. So emotions like fear, anger, love, disgust, those actually exist to help us deal with environmental problems that happen throughout our lives. Okay, so in emotion researchers, they tend to agree that there's a limited number of basic emotions and responses. We'll take a look at some of those in a minute. Now, the neuroscience of emotion, so emotions are associated with distinct patterns of responses by the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system and in the brain. So different emotions stimulate different responses in the brain, and differing patterns of sympathetic nervous system activation are universal. So in red here, I actually put some examples of what occurs in the body and in the brain, different emotional type motivations. So please stop and take a look at those. And here's an interesting thing that has been looked at, and that is, do things, like polygraph tests, can those really detect lies? And it's been determined that no, those actually really all they do is they measure physiological changes associated with emotions. And so here's the thing, here they list some of the potential problems involved with that. So some people can lie without experiencing anxiety or arousal. They'll have no physiological response, whereas innocent people may be fearful or anxious when they're asked incriminating questions. Therefore, their breathing might increase. They may, their blood pressure might rise, things like that. So polygraph tests actually are not very accurate detectors about whether someone is lying or not. Now, in the brain, there are different regions of the brain that deal with emotions, and one of the most important ones to remember at this point is the structure called the amygdala. And if you remember from our neuroscience type discussions, the amygdala, that's part of the limbic system, and that activates when something is threatening, when one feels fear, or hearing sounds that one might relate to fear and trigger our fight or flight response. Now, humans with a damaged amygdala, they actually might experience what's called psychic blindness, and that is an ability to recognize fear in the facial expressions and voices of others. So it's commonly known that individuals that have been who are psychopaths, or even some, that they actually have damaged amygdalas. Now, remember, this is a generalization. This isn't, a hard set fact for every individual. But it's been found, though, that in general, individuals who are psychopaths and things, they actually have damaged or reduced amygdalas. And this just talks about different emotions activating different brain areas. I definitely recommend you pause the video and take a look at this, and especially focus on what I wrote for you, a little bit more kind of detail, what to think about as you look at these PET scan images right here. Now, the difference, about the expression of emotion, like back, when Darwin in the 1800s, he theorized that human emotional expressions are innate and culturally universal. Whereas by 1980, the researcher Ekman, he estimated that the human face is capable of creating more than 7,000 different expressions. Now, the same researcher, Ekman, this just talks about what he found and what he proposes regarding emotional expression. Now, theories of emotion, William James and Lange, they had a theory of emotion that stimulus, this is interesting, that stimulus is perceived, and then we have a physiological and behavioral changes that occur, and that those changes are experienced as a particular emotion. So according to William James, and I put this in red for you here, so you'll understand this a little more in depth. But what was interesting and important to know from this is at first, William James says, we don't tremble and run because we are afraid. We are afraid because we tremble and run. So he believed that the body signals the first triggers the emotional experience. Now, things might be different these days, so these have been challenged. And here are the challenges to these. That actually our emotional reaction to a stimulus is often faster than our physiological reaction. That's something to keep in mind. Now, last but not least here, we're just going to talk about goal setting and achieving one's goals, being motivated to achieve one's goals. So right here are some strategies and suggestions that can help you get motivated, take action, and achieve your goals. Now, I put a few different strategies down here for you in red. And number one is strengthening one's sense of self-efficacy. And that is through, mastery, so mastering your experiences one at a time, starting small, and hierarchically building your sense of self-mastery, self-efficacy. And social modeling or observational learning. So that means referring to, looking at others who are already masters of what you personally want to achieve. Now, turning goals into actions, form goal intention, form the actual intention, write down and be real specific about what your goals are and how you intend to achieve those goals. And that refers to implementation intentions. So how you intend to achieve your goals. And finally, often mentally rehearse and visualize the process of not only achieving the goals, but how you're achieving the goals, what you're doing, what you look like when you're pursuing the goal, how you feel, what your environment looks like, and finally, how you feel when you finally achieve the goals. So those are some just basic strategies and suggestions that I recommend for achieving your goals. So that concludes our discussion on motivation and emotion. Now, I highly recommend, because there's so much information in this video, that you definitely view it more than once and take notes and use those to answer questions in the accompanying study guides. Thanks for your participation.